Oh, I can finally articulate the dread I felt when I saw generic posts that would generally express that the author found men obnoxious. I felt like I was seeing another person recognize that everyone on Earth is currently insane. I have a tendency to state this in a very absolute way as kind of a humorous hyperbole. But I felt like I was seeing another person recognize that everyone on Earth is currently insane. But the post falls totally short of really acknowledging it because they made the insanity contingent on a trait that would earn them some cheap relatability instead of pressing it more and trying to further generalize what they were seeing. Which meant the post was just feeding back into an endless self-sustaining fiction of a social landscape, which they had the reasonable perspective on, the reasonable perspective just being the guise under which they were feeding back into it. So it felt very dishonest and treacherous. I think I tried too hard to find some objective feeling framing for my own sense of social alienation. So let's just say I basically just religiously believe in a giant, horrifying, nameless, inhuman presence that perpetually strains to cheapen and deaden all social interaction as far as it can dig its tendrils, and the deadened states are then prone to find expression in more recognizable forms, like the detestable varieties of masculinity and femininity. And to engage with the states solely on the terms of their convenient facades is to just play the horrifying, nameless inhuman presence's game instead of doing anything in the direction of meaningfully confronting it. In my mind, admitting how horrifyingly alone one can be as a consequence of the inhuman presence, instead of just trying to rebound into the safety net of yet another constructed in-group, feels like the first step, I guess. Basically, I look at Tinder, Facebook, and Omegle, and a strong majority of the people seem insane. I have no reason to suspect that these are tainted as randomly selected samples of the population. And so, if I feel like I'm a reasonable person and I expose myself to people who are naturally in line with all the mainstream cultural currents, and I feel like I have to really, really, really try to sift out anyone I can remotely grasp or get along with, I feel like something about the world is currently making people insane. I have to acknowledge the possibility that I am becoming entirely a product of a distorted perspective, restricting myself to trying to gain an understanding through platforms that people are uniformly not interested in portraying their humanity through, while I am distinctly interested in trying to do that. I'm not sure just how much water this holds. It is absolutely worth taking into account the distorting effects of these awful profit-driven mediums and maybe the, in actuality, very small proportion of humanity that is insane is compelled toward them and the rest are repelled. But it feels like there has to be a point where, if you boil it down enough, these do have to be expressions of the people behind the monitors to some extent. That some grain of this has to persist face to face. And, there's probably something to be said for the idea that the refraction of socialization through profit-driven mediums would just play a part in making everyone insane, and is thus just more strength for my hunch. I cannot convince myself that sincerity is permitted to survive adjacent to mass media and the cultural slant toward leisure and the absolute normalization of the endless intake of fiction and the screens installed in every last home and the odd motivational speech on YouTube that only serves to propagandize and the X to Y pipelines and the. But if I discount all of that and lend some credence to the idea that this all suggests everyone is insane, then this is where I'm supposed to conclude that I am insane, because we all know the narrative that insane people often feel like they're sane and the whole world is against them and stuff like that. And the statistics of me being insane are a lot more reasonable. One person satisfying a condition versus many, 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 many people satisfying that condition. Although you can also use that reasoning to argue that if there really is some autonomous cultural process that's making people insane, then it's also very adapted to shaking the confidence of anyone who is less affected by it. Because in making so many people insane and leaving anyone else less affected to rationally process that, the process would precisely replicate the narrative of being insane for people who aren't insane and lead them straight to the reasoning of that fifth paragraph. And so the process would naturally erode the confidence of any gaps in itself, anyone less affected. The process has cooked the numbers. It has realized that statistically absurd situation. There's maybe a middle ground where the world is incredibly alienated and I am kind of insane too, where I'm just taking my acknowledgement of the alienation too far and using it as a rationale for an impenetrable barrier between myself and everything else, and only letting myself get worse in isolation, not inviting anyone to correct me, to reestablish my sense of normality, to reassure me. It is easy for me at times to slip into mindsets where I feel like the entire planet is a fundamental opposite of me in all ways and there is no escape except to just wait for death. There is the perspective that if most people are so alienating, then I really cherish the ones who aren't, right? So I am correspondingly intimidated by the deep value of those who aren't, and so hesitant to interact. And so it makes perfect sense where I am, connected to subcultures but still very isolated. In touch with somewhat of a home of social sphere, but still hyperfixated on everything outside of it, the alienating landscape, staring at it miserably, silently. My feelings can maybe be summed up by one bolded word expressed by itself, not meant to imply anyone I'm particularly saying it to or anything I'm particularly requesting with it. It is please. Please, for instance, let me solve the dumb Rubik's Cube in my skull, which upon completion says, okay, you can walk up in the hallway and say hi now. It's fine. There's nothing lurking under the situation. I will not reach my full potential if I keep engaging with this website and with any other attention-fracturing thing. I regard a timeline where I don't heal and really utilize my attention span in the same way that I regard a timeline where I drop dead of a heart attack before I even finish typing this sentence. And I really truly am the only one who can make the choices that are needed. Publicly lamenting my diminished attention span while not healing it, even if it comes off like at least speaking out against a phenomenon, is beyond worthless, harmful even for the example it sets. The potential for failure is so very breathing down my neck real. I only have, 13 years of technology conditioning to undo? Okay, pretty hefty, but I still have 67 years left, ideally. Plenty of time. This is practically my whole existence thus far, but surely I am actually living in a teensy footnote that my fulfilled future self looks back on infrequently and cringes when doing so. This seriously isn't something that I can keep pondering and narrating on this kind of platform, by the way. I'm not going to be stupid and fold my process of healing into a narrative that's still under the thumb of the disease. It really, really does take actually taking the measures that I don't want to take, because they will practically eliminate all that I know. They will mangle so many of my frameworks of self-conception and processing of experience and all of that. The only thing that exists in this form of living is sources of suffering masquerading as antidotes to themselves. And as I wise up to that deception, they simply become self-referential as an added layer of deception, and their additional layers of self-reference can scale without limit, in direct proportion to how much I think I've wised up. Posting this is an example of this process. To you, I need to become a void. To you, I need to become a void, I think. I'm not even supposed to be telling you that I need to become a void. Becoming alone with myself is the only choice. I can't fill the void with solitary, attention-fracturing things either. For the good of myself, I need a true justification for suicide. Not literal suicide, but the suicide of the me that I am as these words. To finally do it, to put into practice. I am not going far enough. I am not going a thousandth of far enough to have a bark so practiced and loud that it could blast the whole world to shreds, and no bite is simply perfect for the survival of malignant patterns. In one breath, it can feel like so much creativity is required just to experience one moment of casual freedom. For instance, if I decide I want to physically express freedom, I might thoughtlessly default to running and dancing in a particular way that I quickly decide is really an action foreign to me that I've been trained to adorn with the quality of being a symbol of freedom. It wasn't freedom. It was a cliche. I have to do something else. It has to be considered if I want to really break patterns and bonds. In another breath, well, no, freedom doesn't really have to be considered. In fact, it has to be kind of thoughtless. Explicitly deciding that I want to do some crazy gesture of freedom isn't thoughtless. And it's that initial excess of intent that shunted me into a cliche. And it's the following excess of analysis that lets me identify it as a cliche and devalue it for that. By coincidence, I could thoughtlessly run and dance in an identical way, and it could be freedom, because to not have the action bordered by these excesses of thought seems like freedom. To be impulsive and sincere and not make one's actions so contrived seems like freedom. But then, what if it's in thoughtless freedom that I let my guard down and become totally inhabited by foreign patterns without noticing? And as a result, my life becomes sort of drab and prefabricated and lifeless. What if I run and dance in cliche ways, and they're very much not coincidences? I feel like the world is very populated by patterns right now, which makes it unsafe in these terms. I feel I wouldn't have to do all of this overthought if the world hadn't been made unsafe in this way. It's sad. Too many albums exist. It's good that there's so many albums. There's so much beauty for people to explore. It's an endless landscape. It's too much for me. I'm too weak to dive in. Exploration takes place at a constant rate of one song per song. The speed of this rate varies with the song, but it always seems too slow. I feel like dopaminergic entertainment and pastimes have ruined me, instilled me with impatience, left me deeply in need of repair that will be terribly prolonged. An artistic resource, a collection of seminal works, a bibliography, a textbook, it only feels like a checklist to satisfy. I'm not sure what I want. I guess I just want to lie down. I want to fold up and escape into my thoughts instead of rigidly conforming them to the shape of the waveform of a song. The artistic dialogue is too exhausting. I'm sorry. I'm genuinely so sorry for regarding a richness that is present in life and then simply feeling the urge to retract. It makes me feel like the opposite of a being. I feel like I am choosing death. I should be donating my energy to art and receiving energy back in turn, and I am failing. I never feel like I am sinking into anything, losing myself in anything, only studying it listlessly. When I do sink into anything, it tends to sort of hang tenuously by a thread, constantly at risk of collapsing into the mere narrative of itself sinking into something. I mean the mere narrative of myself sinking into something, which I then observe from outside of myself. And yet, once I do lie down to fold up, that is when an impatience takes hold. I am not at peace as a maddening stillness and silence fall over the room. I do need something after all, as the inherent conditions of life, the desire for dynamics and experience and mental content, it all shouts at me to just connect to what exists, to amass and collect things to find beauty in, to allow myself to dive and explore and feel the beauty of this and that thing and to learn. And so I reconsider diving in. But again, the weight of it all, the amount of it all, seems like too much. I sit paradoxically in a limbo between retraction and engagement. I just have to try. I just have to try. I just have to try to live. Try to live. Materially secure, yet trying to live. If there's one thing I feel I've learned, it's that when I take a freeing sense of unseriousness and frivolity and reduce it from its unabated and really expressed self to an ideal to cling to through periods of despondency, then, well, once I feel ready to unfold it back from an ideal to what it really is and express it, I will find myself shocked by just how forgiving and real it is, and by just how low I had lowered my standards during that time of despondency, and by how I hadn't even noticed myself forgetting and giving up on the real goodness that the ideal was a placeholder for. I can never just relax anymore. Like, during a drive home, my dad and brother are riffing on a beer ad on the radio, and I'm just sitting there in my head going, parodying mainstream media is living death. I don't know, it's like someone throws you in a cell filled with human waste and doesn't even lock the door, and you comfort yourself by writing, "This cell is stupid" on the wall with the waste instead of just leaving. Lending the beer ad even the crumb of legitimacy implied by the notion that you're finding some higher degree of honesty by subverting its contents, instead of just turning it off. If you are techno crazy, I think you will hear a song for the first time, and instead of respecting your own animal intake of novel stimuli and approaching it on those terms, you'll unconsciously use the high view count on YouTube, plus the general tone of the comments, perhaps uniformly nostalgic, to infer that it is classic or widely recognized music, and take to speaking about it in a way that tends to emphasize acknowledging the classic quality that is alien to you over the novelty that you actually experienced, so as to not sound naive, as if you instead possess the alternative to naivete, which would seem to be an absolutely comprehensive grasp of its place in culture to the extent that you have been present for every MP3 playback, when really each person has only their particular memories of the song, and all they can do beyond that is fumble blindly at the metadata of its existence, the reviews and statistics and encyclopedic info, and maybe feel like it all meaningfully represents some commonality around it with others. Or maybe I am just totally trash talking the freeing possibilities from one's cultural perspective that are opened by technology. Who knows? I just don't like feeling imprisoned in second order observation.